A city on the verge of greatness. A new type of city, based not on the man, but on the automobile. The car. A symbol of freedom and vitality.
As of today, it has been 6 years since LA Noire was first released on the Xbox 360, PS3, with the PC following a few months later. Taking us through the gritty streets of LA in the year 1947, in a land filled with crime, corruption, transformation, hate, and a nasty, growing drug problem, we are placed in control of Cole Phelps to do what we can to right the city. However, the problems of our neo-noir LA extends far past the Hollywood land sign, with problems showing up in the story, mechanics, and design core to the game. That's not to say that all is lost, because what Team Bondi created is unlike anything else and carries the heart and soul of its world, and it's not afraid to proudly show it. It has been fondly looked upon since its release years ago. LA Noire has stuck with gamers, it's stuck with me. But is it the authenticity of the world that we get to explore, the hours of puzzle solving trying to find out if you really have the right guy? Maybe it's the story that kept you looking and thinking about solving just one more case and maybe finding one more clue. Or is it just nostalgia and we see the game through noir colored glasses? This week we are going to be doing a Noire Retrospective to see what LA Noire can offer 6 years since its release. And for those of you who have not played it yet, or maybe waiting for the upcoming re-release on the Xbox One, PS4, or Switch for their playthrough, please know that there will be spoilers, as that is the nature of retrospectives. So you have been warned. If you're waiting until those new releases, hit the subscribe button right down below and you can catch my video after you finish. Ready? Here we go. From its critical reception of high 8s and 9s out of 10 from most reviewers, this game still stands with a solid Metacritic score of 89 out of 100. With that solid popularity spike from the beginning, it has grown into one of the games that most gamers have purchased, however not all have experienced. This becomes especially true with the PC version, as it has seen numerous price drops, pushing as low as $2.33 US for the base game and $9 flat for the complete edition, which includes all the DLC. This probably places it alongside Witcher 2 and most Valve games as the cheap games that pretty much every PC gamer owns, but probably never finished. To put this into perspective, the statistics of Steam show that approximately 1.6 million Steam users own LA Noire. However, only about 18,000 of those owners have been recorded as getting the final achievement for completing all 5 desks, and by extension finishing the game. That's about 11%, which is pretty low. Now, despite those statistics, LA Noire has been giving overwhelming support from the gaming community. Why is that? What makes it stick with people? There are a few factors that I feel stood out and still do stand out, making LA Noire connect with people and still stay relevant even today. But looking back, there's one thing that hooked people from the beginning, and that's almost synonymous with the game, which is the technology that they used to give players a perspective and detail that's never been done on this scale before, and unfortunately since. When building the game, the development team knew that in order to give the player the true experience of interrogating the citizens of 1940s LA, we needed to have faces, real faces. Faces to analyze, to question, to believe. We needed real faces. Because in a game like this, we had to be pushed to look closer at the characters across the table and question if that little tick of looking around was guilt or just who they are. At the time, facial motion capture, which is used by most AAA developers nowadays, was extremely difficult to work with, especially on this scale and the detail that was needed for this game. The technology that they decided to give us instead to provide that experience was called motion scan, and for the uninitiated, the technology basically took full 3D scans of the actors' faces and created a digital mesh containing all the details of the actors' faces and added it later into the game. The amazing thing that this technique gave us as the gamers was having an experience like no other experience we've had before. It allows us to see subtle features and emotions that actors can add into their performances, which would have been extremely time consuming or near impossible to have been hand modeled or adapted from facial motion capture. This is what the game was really about, because how we saw these characters and how we interpret their actions and emotions ties directly into the core mechanics and really the goal of finding the right person. However, this technology did have its shortcomings that would begin to show up soon after that initial charm of the tech wore off, as you begin to notice small cracks in the facade that we spend the whole game analyzing. The most noticeable problem about using this technology turned out had nothing to do with the technology at all. It was the actors. The cast of the game consisted of a mixed bag, from fantastic actors like Aaron Staton, most well known from his performance in Mad Men, playing our main character of Cole Phelps, to much smaller actors playing side characters in our current Find the Bad Guy quest. When acting is done great, it's seamless, and even some of the side characters surprised me with how well they handled their character and conveyed it through just that facial capture. However, there were other actors who would consistently seem to struggle with the idea of how to act like they're lying, which leads me to believe that some of the performances led to the developers just picking the least worst performance and putting it in. The logistics of creating these recordings starts to become a problem when you need to take the recordings and actually place them in the game, with problems connected to movement as well as just creating a dialogue back and forth between the characters. This created two problems that can be seen throughout the game. The first is that the animation of the facial expressions and the body language rarely connected, giving almost the effect that the head and the body were two separate entities mashed together to live out their lives in the 1940s. Admittedly, there are times that the facial animations and the mocap animations do work well together, but more often than not, they are at odds. However, this is only one of the two main disconnects that this technology creates. The second area comes from the fact that the actors are never able to talk directly back and forth with a person that they're supposed to be dealing with in-game. They are forced to act like they are with someone and hope that the developers can edit together the performances into something that feels somewhat natural. And this is not an easy task because the dialogue is not natural by nature of the technology. The conversations between the characters feel disconnected and choppy and can lead to some downright impressive tonal shifts, like your character did a bump of coke during the last cutaway and just really needs a conviction for that next fix. Overall, it was a tremendous risk for Team Bondi to take on the motion scan technology, and for what they did with it, it actually turned out very well, especially considering that the game averages about 20 plus hours and is heavily dialogue driven. This was the first time we got a chance to see a character in greater detail with minute gestures that we had to analyze, and it seemed like the future. Unfortunately, it was the limitations of the technology and not the fault of the developers, which led to some disconnects throughout the game, which can lead to moments that you can shrug off while others just stand out like a sore thumb. Before the game even arrived, the technology was center stage, even receiving its own dedicated development trailer, along with other trailers in true Rockstar style as the publisher, focusing on some new, different aspect of the game as it led up to that final 2011 launch. And as we all sat there, we crossed our fingers that it would live up to all those promises. When we finally got our copies, got home, sat down, opened them up, to find that it required a whopping 3 discs for the Xbox 360 version, we knew we were in for something big. PlayStation owners didn't quite have that experience thanks to the Blu-ray. Either way, after we put our game in, we were thrown into just what we were promised. A meticulously designed, period-accurate, mid-century LA, complete with the period brand cars and architecture and culture. spanning across 5 different desks across the city of LA, starting with patrol, then traffic, homicide, vice, and ending with arson. The player follows Cole Phelps through a rise and fall in the LAPD. Returning from World War II, Cole finds himself joining the police department as one of their patrol officers, placing us as the players at the beginning of the game. Working patrol in LA leads us to our first crime within minutes of starting the game. We help find evidence for detectives coming to a scene, starting the player's extremely long tutorial, which seems to last the rest of the patrol and through to the end of the traffic desk. The very short 4 cases on the patrol desk focus on teaching the player to do the more tactile actions of the game, picking up evidence and examining it, chasing down suspects on foot and on car, and the basics of the shooting mechanisms seen throughout the game. After which, the police pull us out of our tutorial part 1 and smack dab in tutorial part 2, the traffic desk. The 5 cases in traffic range from murder, accidents, or just plain deception. 2 of the 5 cases did live a short life as DLC before the release of the complete edition later on. The heart of these cases focused on giving the player an opportunity to become more familiar with the controls and mechanisms of the entire investigation system and better connect the player with the city. Starting off with the driver's seat, we are confronted with a story based around infidelity and a man's desire to run away from his wife to his second girl. Next we have Counsel's car, shedding light on the cultural and racial divide that existed between immigrants at the time and the society that they moved into. With a marriage made in heaven, a woman plots the murder of her husband to use the insurance money to further her own interests, seeing that she would be more successful building something on her own. In a slip of the tongue, we are thrown into the middle of a car theft racket, trying to piece together who's to blame without all of the modern vehicle tracking that we know today. Finally, we get a true taste of Hollywoodland in The Fallen Idol, seeing the manipulative and deadly movie system that can bring young, naive girls in only just to exploit their ambitions. Each of these missions gives the player a closer look into the world that LA Noire is trying to create, and providing a new perspective with every case. The use of these cases paralleled with the tutorial sections that go along with them is expertly done, killing 2 birds with 1 stone. However, this section does introduce the player to some not so positive elements that continue to show up more and more throughout the game. The most noticeable of these elements being that we get our first real taste of the street crimes. There are 40 street crimes throughout LA Noire that consist of small, single-scene crimes that end with our suspects either in the back of a police car or in the coroner's wagon. However great the idea of having these crimes that take place throughout the game provide more of a believable world and paint a true picture of the dark LA that we're promised, it does bring to light other problems with the game that unfortunately I feel I have to talk about now. Before I get into this, I'd like to start off with a positive, with credit where credit is due, as it is extremely refreshing to play through these small cases and know that each and every one is a self-contained story that was specifically designed and in no way randomly generated. As of the time of this video, we are seeing an increase in reliance on randomly generated elements in games, from loot to quests to events and entire maps. Being able to explore every one of these crimes and knowing that thought and care went into the writing, acting, and overall development was something that 2011 Devin J would not have been nearly as excited about. On the other hand, the one thing that 2011 me and 2017 me do agree on, and that is how the crimes are given to us. There are 2 ways to start street crimes. The first comes from hearing a call over the radio announcing the crime, where you'll be able to then go in search of whatever was called in. The second way is something the player will end up doing more and more, which is looking at the map. And if you're interested in getting all of the street crimes and not wanting to drive around until you hear something about the next crime over the radio, then it is more efficient to just check the map before you get in the car. This does, however, take up a ton of time, but I'll get into that a little bit later on. Now, this would not have been an extremely large problem But near the end of the game, where you might have 10 plus locations to jump between, the task of checking your map can become tedious extremely quick. In addition to needing to check your map for the street crimes, the crimes themselves can take the player miles out of their way, sometimes even to the opposite side of the map, just to check them out. Now the player has the option to fast travel between locations, but that turns each of these crimes into their own glorified mini-games, with a loading screen before and after as we travel there and back, and taking away that initial feeling of a connected world. And choosing to fast travel between these street crimes would leave the player with 80 loading screens before they complete all of them, rather than spending hours driving through the city. The other thing that the street crimes demonstrate to the player is a severe lack of variety in addressing conflict. There's only a small handful of crimes that provide the option of shooting or arresting a suspect. Most crimes are reduced to following an exact set of steps, like a checklist, until the end cutscene plays. Even the chases have predetermined ends and don't really encourage player skill or action, only letting things happen when the game says they can. But I'll save that rant for a little later. But these small elements begin to build up, with these street crimes becoming more and more aggravating the longer you play the game, and kind of make you question whether you really want to get all 40, or just let a few get away. Now, after completing all 5 of the cases on the traffic desk, you as the player have a much better feel for how the game mechanics and the rules of the world work. This section of cases really provide a strong foundation for the rest of the game to build on. However, when you look at the actual time it takes for you to get there in the game, it can take 5 to 7 hours to complete the game up until that point, depending on your knowledge and experience with the game. Now, that's not entirely uncommon in video games that have a 50+ hour range, but in this case it ends up being about a third of the game's main content that's set aside almost just for tutorial. And it's not that it's not doing a good job, because there are very few games that feel as real as the LA that the developers created and needed time to develop the city itself. Now, there are 2 ideas that I begin to butt heads with. The first is that they feel it's necessary to spend this much time in proportion to the rest of the game to develop the world and the mechanics alone, before really diving into the main meat of the game. Because LA Noire really is broken up into 4 main plot stories, with Homicide, Vice, and Arson, and the overarching story of Cole, none of which are dealt with until we reach our 3rd desk of Homicide. My second problem is that there is very little overall narrative movement within that 5 to 7 hours spent on the tutorial. I understand that the main plot of the game is to follow Cole through the time at the LAPD, but the pacing of the game begins to hurt near the end of the traffic desk before the game stories really even start. This beginning sequence would have been much better suited to the player watching some sort of prologue before playing and entering with 1 or 2 cases to solve and really learn the ropes in traffic before moving forward into the rest of the game, where the stories would have a much more elaborate and detailed plot. However, despite the jumping around we do across the 5 cases in traffic, when it finally comes to a close, we are promoted to Homicide, and we are given something of a narrative transition, adding the final key characters that we need to know for a majority of the rest of the game. Those 2 characters come in the form of our future partner in Vice, Roy Earl, who we do get little glimpses of the longer we play through, but quickly comes off as not Cole's type of person. We also meet Elsa, our next character, but she doesn't show up for some time in the game, and her absence is a little bit odd, but we'll get to that a little bit later. After taking its time to provide the player a significant foundation for the rest of the game, LA Noire then throws the player headfirst, starting with the 4 main stories in the game. Our life at the Homicide desk is centered around the Black Dahlia murders. However, the game tries to encourage us to not make that connection just yet. Time and time again, we hear from our partner, other police, even Cole himself, about the dangers of jumping to conclusions and connecting evidence without evidence. This leads the beginning of this story to feel more like a continuation of Traffic Desk, jumping around from crime to crime thinking that you're doing a spot-on job. even after we hear Cole's outer monologue about his uncertainty about the convictions, we press on. Because despite the evidence and sometimes entirely unbelievable connections that are made from the crimes, we still find a way to convict someone based on the law. Even in one case, we have the option to wrongingly convict a suspect because of the blood on his shoes, even though if we calm down for just a couple minutes and checked the blood with the blood of the victim, we would have found it doesn't match. It's these little oversights that add up to narrative errors that show their head over and over throughout this desk, as the game pushes the player towards the twist it has planned, where we find the real murderer. At which point we're sent on a follow the breadcrumbs quest whose entire existence is laughable, to find the actual killer. I mean, under what circumstances does providing a trail of clues back to yourself provide anything other than the most base stupidity of an idea? And after convincing the police to wrongingly convict multiple people, it's easy to expect a little bit more from this criminal mastermind. That's not the only thing that's wrong with this twist at the end, because on top of it being hinted at multiple times throughout the case, it basically renders all of the previous cases in Homicide pointless. After going through 5 cases before we are given the big reveal, the player is pretty much told that all of the work in crime solving was for nothing, providing something of a 6-hour middle finger. Putting this into the context of the game up until now, at this point we have spent the first half of the game doing a tutorial and the second half of our game wrongingly convicting people right and left. And it's here because of this twist that I feel that most people begin to drop off from playing and finishing the game, because it's this cheap twist that makes irrelevant hours of the player's time and work, just so they can give you a gotcha moment. Along with that, we are taught from Patrol and Traffic Desk how the mechanics of the game works. If we talk to everyone, collect all of the evidence, analyze it correctly, and make judgments based off that evidence, we can convict a suspect off of that evidence, knowing that we have done the right thing. With each of these homicide desks even giving us a 5-star ratings in the cases even though we convict the wrong person. This change of expectations just for a twist turns all the rules that we expected from the introductory cases in that foundation around and says these really don't matter, only reinforcing the player's increasing desire to turn off the game and go and play something that actually plays by its own rules. The thing is, it didn't have to be this way though. There are ways that this part of the game could have been developed that would have kept the twist while keeping the cases central to the overall story of Homicide Desk. Starting off with something simple that the game already has but doesn't really make full use of is the world that it created. In my alternate ideal LA Noire, this alternate homicide story would have us exploring LA Noire and the cases in the Homicide Desk much more organic by way of being truly part of the world, placing all of the homicide cases into one continuous story without breaks in between the cases or the need to convict someone before you can move on to the next case. The player would be placed in an open city with multiple crimes to address and follow it something of a real-time development as more crimes are discovered or committed the longer we play through the desk. This change would still have allowed the cases that exist in the game that we find out later are perpetrated by the Black Dahlia murderer, but it could also allow for other cases that could be thrown in to throw off the player's scent and have the player determine which cases are connected to which, or that stand alone. But going back to my ideal LA Noire story, under this new story arc in my made-up LA Noire world, we would have a quick introduction and tutorial before the player entered into Homicide, with the time that was spent on the creation of those introductory cases could provide more time for side case content in Homicide, Vice, and Arson. These side cases could start off easy, introducing the new desk and what the player can expect from cases to come. Now, this new open case system would save the player from that final moment at the end of Homicide Desk where they sit back in their chair thinking, well, that was pretty much pointless, and provide them with a much more organic progression through the cases and the collection of evidence as they piece together the puzzle of a much larger story of the Black Dahlia. Or maybe they push through the cases and they don't look at the larger picture of the murders and end up wrongly convicting the suspects, just to say that they got the conviction. Where at the end, the player would be confronted with a hit that there might have been something larger at work. This new system would also allow a good chunk of replayability to the game, in comparison to the overall lack of choices that currently exist in LA Noire. Now, this imaginary system of mine would continue across the next 2 desks. With some modifications here and there, it would have made the Vice and Arson Desk vastly more enjoyable to play as well. Moving forward, of the 4 spotlight stories in LA Noire, the Vice desk seems to be the desk with the most solid structure and flow compared to the rest, at least until the second half of the final mission. Now, I do say that it is one of the best, but that does come with one condition: if the newspapers never existed. Now, for those of you who don't know, there are newspapers that can be collected within LA Noire that give a glimpse into a larger drug ring that we see progress throughout the rest of the game. And within the first 10 minutes of starting the game, the player is introduced to this newspaper collecting minigame. With each paper we pick up, we get a deeper look into this drug trade that we don't really experience until we hit the Vice desk halfway through the game, which at that point we already know the motives for some of the people who are involved, taking away that surprise that we might have had at uncovering these people and their motives on our own rather than just being handed them. In the multiple times that I've played through LA Noire, I have struggled to find the exact reasoning for all of these video clips that give away larger plot points while encouraging the players to collect them all. Now, if you're looking to play through this game in the future, I would encourage you to hold back on watching the videos of the newspapers and just picking up the newspapers themselves. Because when the game finally wraps up, they are wholly unnecessary and only provide a point of disconnect between the story and perspective. From the beginning of the game, we are under the impression that we are Cole, and that the story is being told through us. But then how are these newspaper clips known to the player? It creates one more point of a growing disconnect that we will see more towards the end of the game and worsen the overall experience. There was potential in the newspapers though, and could have been used extremely effectively as a world building and connecting device that the player would have a chance to discover if they were so inclined. First off, for both the newspaper to be improved and the game as a whole, we need to get rid of the flashback story that it tells, giving away crucial plot information that would be better told from Cole's perspective through small discoveries, or even trusting the player to actually be a detective and make the connections themselves. How these newspapers would have been used would be able to grow off my proposed ideal LA Noire system with the larger open game sections of Homicide, Vice, and Arson. With the player possibly unsure of whether their convictions were made correctly, these newspapers would be able to effectively look back at the cases and give us an update on how we did. With the player possibly unsure of whether their convictions were made correctly, the newspapers could provide some insight into how they did in the previous cases. Each of these newspapers could highlight a previous case outcome. Maybe you convicted the correct person, so you see a short clip of them going to jail, or a judge pointing out all the evidence that marks their guilt. Or if you did convict the wrong person, a clip could be shown of the person getting out of jail, or at the police station stating that the evidence was not enough. Maybe as another possibility, if we convicted the wrong person, we might see a clip of the real suspect getting convicted for a similar crime. Maybe they killed again, or the police found evidence after you moved on that pinned them to the crime. This system of finding the outcomes of your convictions would serve to further connect you to the world that you're in and show the lasting consequences to the choices that you've made. However, this is only my dream LA Noire of what could have been. For now, we're stuck with a newspaper that gives away story points long before we even know their relevance, and some final pieces of the puzzle long before we know what the image is supposed to look like. Making our way through the Vice desk, we work alongside our self-serving two-faced partner, Roy Earl. doing what we can do to take down this larger morphine racket sweeping across the Los Angeles Valley. From murder site to dealer houses, we weave our way through the LA streets, getting closer and closer to the source of the drugs, collecting evidence every step of the way. Now this is why the Vice desk hits the hardest out of all the other desks, because the case builds upon itself, giving the player just a little bit more information to use in the next case and the next case and so on. Not only do these cases lead us along from point to point, giving us little bits of information about a larger story, it also provides the illusion of larger forces at work, giving just small glimpses of the mob, the corruption across the city, but most notably the corruption within the LAPD itself, as we see Roy cozy up to suspects on more than one occasion. By the close of the Vice desk, so long as we don't really pay attention to the newspapers, the player has uncovered an entire underground system of drugs, crime, and corruption spanning the city. Compared to the Homicide desk, this system provides the player a chance at the closest thing to being a detective that the entire game achieves. However, nearing the end of the desk, problems of perspective begin to creep in. In the beginning, the player is led to believe that they are playing the game from the perspective of Cole Phelps, the war veteran, the good cop. However, the longer the game plays, the greater that disconnect becomes between the player and Cole. Through the first 3 desks, Patrol, Traffic, and Homicide, we expect that whatever's happening to Cole is also happening to us, that we are one and the same. Aside from the newspaper flashbacks, which I've already said my piece about, the game holds to that idea until nearing the end of the Vice desk, with even smaller war flashbacks that Cole experiences show what Cole went through in the war and led to further develop pieces of his character through his past. Despite some of the flashbacks feeling a little bit necessary and only used to remind us that the flashbacks exist, most of the flashbacks give context to the 4th and largest story, which is Cole's story. But I'll get to that a little bit later on. Nearing the end of the Vice desk, we get small breakaway moments that the player really doesn't have any right of having access to if we are Cole. Most notable of these being a full scene where we have talked to the mob and left a restaurant, and we find the camera lingering as they begin to talk about plans because we are really getting too close to their crime ring and they need to stop us. This is the scene that up until this point has no business existing within the game entirely, and had the game kept with that single perspective of Cole throughout, this clip would have been entirely unnecessary. However, this is just the first step in an entire perspective change as we near the end of our time at Vice desk and continue on to Arson. It's here where the game brings back Elsa. Remember that side character that I mentioned at the end of Traffic? Some, 12 hours of gameplay ago? Well, only to further provide that perspective disconnect that's presented to the player, we find ourselves tailing Elsa from her gig at the Blue Room. To the player, we're looking for something wrong. Maybe she knows more than she told us. What if she's involved with the mob? Could she be part of some larger conspiracy? We get out of our car and follow her up to her apartment, and as Cole moves closer, the player begins to feel uneasy. This feels like nothing like our tailing sequences before, and the fact that Cole is alone leads us to think that there's more to the story than we think. Opening the door and embracing Elsa, we find ourselves wholly disconnected from Cole as a character. He is not the Cole that we thought he was. He was not us. And maybe that's what the developers wanted us to experience. But out of all the perspectives to give the player, why would he choose to have our perspective the same as the citizens and the officers within the game? Just like those in the city, we saw him as a family man, a man of morals, and by many examples, an ideal romantic. But that changes. We see him as something different because before, when we saw him as us, we knew everything, but now we don't. It created a disconnect. But narrative-wise, what is gained by keeping his actions away only to throw the player off the trust that we had in the person who we thought we were? Maybe it was to make the transition into the second half of the Arson Desk easier with a greater disconnect, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Because that's where Cole's sleeping around leads him, the Arson Desk. Continuing these unfamiliar perspective shifts, we find out that Roy has also followed Cole, and his corruption has pushed him to get Cole out of the Vice Squad, ensuring that no one is to get close to the criminals that he's cozied up with. As I mentioned before, this switch on perspective only becomes more central to the story as the player moves into the final, and from my perspective, the shortest desk, Arson. As fitting as it is, walking around the destroyed rubble of a once happy family home is very connected to the damage that Cole has done to his own home. Going even further, Cole is placed in the same position that we as the players are, digging through a destroyed foundation that a life was built on, trying to figure out what everything means. What do all of these pieces mean? Who is this story about, and where do we go from here? Arson continues as we begin to see a greater shift in perspective. Starting with two cases very similar to the beginning of Vice, the start of Arson looks extremely promising, giving us small glimpses in what appears to be a greater puzzle to be solved across our final desk. Unfortunately, it's how we solve this final greater case that the game starts to fall flat, with Arson being what feels like the shortest of the three desks, with only one DLC to break up the desk. Upon completing the first two cases, Cole seems to already be hitting a wall in the first house fire cases, with people in the department telling him to back off the investigation, or his superiors will start causing him problems. Knowing where getting on the bad side of the LAPD got him last time, Cole reaches for some outside help in the form of one of the soldiers that he was close to during the war. However, we are not initially told about the reasoning for their falling out. We learn later through Cole's flashbacks that it was because of orders that Cole had given that led to numerous civilians getting killed during the war that pushed these two apart. It's here where we find ourselves at the beginning of the third case, and where Arson Desk really begins to pick up speed, time-wise, not plot-wise. Starting off with the largest perspective shift in the entire game, we find ourselves starting our third desk playing Kelso, Cole's old soldier friend, who now works in insurance. With the ability to investigate the crimes surrounding the fires and what appears to be a larger threat, Kelso can dive deeper into the cases that we are told to leave alone as Cole. This might seem like an easy shift to make, allowing the player to continue investigating the crime while separating from Cole. However, this shift to Kelso's perspective is entirely unnecessary to tell the story. It only serves to further pad out the game. Following this open LA Noire layout that I idealize, this section would have still worked just as well and arguably provided a much more cohesive story if everything was connected in an open real-time world like the previous two desks, where the player would be faced with multiple arson cases and needing to connect the ones that are related to the main case fires and those that are more isolated incidents. We would be able to follow Cole throughout the rest of the game while still using Kelso as our partner of sorts to help us out with the investigation. Keeping the established system of playing as Cole would allow the game to use some of its strengths to tell a larger story of what's going on. This can come in the form of dialogue between characters as they drive around and move about the world. Rather than playing as Kelso on the missions, maybe we might be able to follow him along, keeping in a large chunk of the content that Kelso experiences, but also preserving that perspective that we are presented with for a majority of the game prior. The dialogue between Kelso and Cole could help illustrate a deeper connection that the two have had, and the reason that they parted ways. Disconnecting the player and placing them as a near omniscient being in the third act of the game, jumping from character to character, does the game no favors. The ability to stick with Cole throughout this final desk as we continue along with him discovering the corruption surrounding this new home development, all the way to finding the catalyst that started the actual fires. This would only serve to enhance the impact of Cole's final sacrifice at game's end. That final sacrifice would bring the fourth story of LA Noire to the close, the story of Cole Phelps. His story was not one of loss and redemption of his life as a moral man, but a man of duty, and he gave his life for the duty to others. The duty to the badge that he swore to uphold, the friends that he cared for, and the greater good above the corruption blanketing the city. He died a moral man, strong and thoughtful, sacrificing himself for those around him and the hope that his sacrifice would not be in vain. Panning down at his funeral, we see Roy Earl giving his eulogy. And at Cole's funeral, we know that the sacrifice didn't change the world. It didn't stop the world in its tracks. The world kept turning, leaving the player with the same sinking feeling that Kelso and Elsa are left with at the end, knowing that the powers that surrounded them and pushed against them are still there and greater than they could have ever expected. The world keeps turning. Whether the sacrifice that Cole gives in the end is impactful or not is a question that we will all end up asking. Did it make any difference? What does it say about the world around us, and does it change who Cole is? To me, it did make a difference. Because despite the shortcomings of our tragic hero, he did not fall short with his lifelong drive to help people and his duty to others. From his experience in the war to his police department desks, he always tried to keep his sense of duty to those around him. And in every sense of the tragic hero, there was always something that he just couldn't get right. In the war, it was the moral choice to destroy a building that turned out to be a hospital. In Los Angeles, it was his family that he let down, losing the trust through infidelity. As a character, Cole can't win. He can only get so far before being pushed back down. His sacrifice was the character's ability to take action into his own hands and make his last choice matter. Maybe the world kept turning, filling itself with corruption, but without his sacrifice, the world would be short two more people, Elsa and Kelso. And no matter how large or small the gain from the sacrifice like this is, it is a gain. With the two back in the world, it still leaves potential for more good to be done. In his last moments, Cole is someone very different than who he is at the beginning of the game. Timid at the start of the game, we grow with him as he learns the ropes, becoming a detective in a city overcome with change. But as time goes on, he gets his footing and never lets go. Even when demoted to Arson, he is standing strong, ready to prove himself once again. Despite hearing about his success from nearly every single person in LA, Cole does not seem to do what he does for fame. He does it because it's what he's supposed to do, because of his duty. Because it is his duty to the badge and the city to make it a better place. And in his final act, he does not go back down on that duty, giving his life for those around him. But when it comes to the question of, did it make any difference? Maybe that's just a question that each of us needs to answer on our own. In spite of all of my criticisms of this game, there are a number of things that LA Noire does extremely well, and rarely even see sometimes today. The first and most impressive thing that Team Bondi developed in LA Noire was the city. Many other games have created period cities like the Mafia series or other Grand Theft Auto games and even the Assassin's Creed series. However, those games focus on the feel of the city rather than the overall accuracy of a real city, filled with people and other cultures, societal differences, and a change that happens continuously. This is where LA Noire shines, because it's not only its accuracy to creating a living world across an 8-mile long map, but it also fills that map with a people affected by the world around them that shows the change that can wear people down or build them up. Exploring cultural pressure points across nearly all of the characters in the game, each having their own virtues and vices. From our racist partner, Roy Earl, who sees himself above all, especially those who are different than him. We explore the change of views on race and acceptance in the mid-20th century. The widespread sexism that existed is seen in nearly every single character in the game, with their perceived roles being subservient to men, with only a small handful trying to break that cycle. Along with that, we see the hate of nationality running fresh through the city as many struggled to move past the war and the animosity that came with it. Being Hollywoodland, there is no shortage of opportunists. Whether it's waiting for the next young actress wanting to make it big, returning GIs wanting to start a new life, or just citizens looking to make their mark on a city, people are everywhere looking to take advantage. LA Noire does not shy away from these faults in the culture and instead shows them proudly, because it's not the bricks in the buildings and the pavement on the streets that make this world real. It is the people and all of their faults and aspirations that make the city what it is. That's not to say that there is not an enormous amount of detail in the world, because there is, and it is a sight to behold. Like details that I've rarely seen outside of racing games is a use of trademarks. Period accurate trademarks ranging from studios to cars to little pieces of the world spread out across the city. Not shying away from including those period touches is what makes LA stand out from almost all other period games. Placing LA Noire not in some fictional world or alternate reality of cities like Empire Bay, New Bordeaux, Vice City, LA is our world, a real world. It's our history, and it's more of a city than San Andreas could have ever been. Even down to the game wells spread across the city for emergencies further lead to the believability of the world that we're fighting to protect. Now, this period accuracy does have its flaws though, and starts to show those flaws early on because of one mechanic that could have easily been changed, which comes in the form of the map. Using the map in LA Noire quickly becomes an act of tedium, all due to the fact of its access and the inability to pull out to see the entire map. Only seeing about a third of the map from any given point forces the player to adjust the map at a snail's pace to see what's hidden beyond the edge of the screen. This doesn't seem like a big problem, but let me further explain. This becomes particularly tiresome when trying to complete all of the street crimes, forcing the player to scroll across an entire map to ensure that they are not missing out on one of the street crimes. This might seem like a small nitpick, but when we are looking in terms of 40 street crimes, where some cases might have multiple street crimes pop up within, it becomes up to the player to check the map every single time they get in the car, with their fingers crossed, entering the menu, selecting the map, and zooming out, then painstakingly panning across the entire map with the hope that it gives them a street crime to make it all worth it. Unfortunately, this is rarely the case. With only 40 crimes in the game, the number of times you need to check your map end up being, with some rough math, accounting for all 84 locations in the game that you'll bounce between, and the numerous times that you will go back and forth between locations, especially the police station. You can expect to need to check the map and scroll from bottom to top at a minimum of 100 times throughout your play. Nearly all of this frustration could have been solved with two simple changes: a dedicated map button and the ability to zoom the camera out of the map to see the entire city. Simple fixes to a problem can account to almost an entire 30 minutes of menu navigation to check the map throughout your entire LA Noire playthrough. This ends up being about 2% of your game. And I know that doesn't sound like very much, but taking also into consideration the 80 load times if you were choosing to fast travel to each of those street crimes, not including to individual locations, just the street crimes, you are looking at easily hours of your time wasted on using menus and loading screens to fast travel. Now, don't let this confuse you. The map itself is not the problem, because the size and reach of it does an amazing job of transitioning the player from one area to another while still feeling like a coherent city. Rather than having drastically different sections next to each other, it created a unified and accurate map that felt more like a real-world map than any other game I've played. Now, this does come with all the positives and negatives of being so accurate. While it does contribute to the believability of the city, driving around a real map becomes much less interesting than ones that are designed to engage the player and make traveling that map fun. Unfortunately, making traveling fun is not the case, and traveling across the map can become tiring very fast. Because no matter how beautiful the accuracy of the city is, driving through it is an entirely different story. This is where the quick travel mechanic in LA Noire comes to play, which for the most part is well implemented aside from the long loading times. Rather than inexplicably teleporting the player to a next destination, Cole suggests his partner drive, making use of that whole second character that does very little else throughout the game, aside from give Cole someone to talk to or direct the player to evidence that we might not have noticed. Now there's a point in the game where the player hits a wall, and driving from place to place, unless they're right next door, becomes extremely exhausting, and LA Noire divulges itself into a game of loading screens and individual locations that might have existed in their own world because just teleporting there is easier than the experience of driving. The longer you play the game, the more the game feels like it doesn't even want the player to drive across the city, penalizing the player for every bump and scratch that they make on the city, and at the end of the mission, only incentivizing us to use fast travel more. Fixing this problem would take much more than just fixing one element. Parts across the entire game would need to be altered to make driving a better option. First of all, making the map more enjoyable to traverse. While staying true to the historical accuracy, some creative licensing changes could have been made to make getting from one place to another more enjoyable, even including some sort of GPS system option to help direct the player, taking away the need to check and recheck the map to make sure that you are going down the right street. Maybe even giving the player something else to do while the partner's driving, such as allowing time to sit and examine the evidence while traveling, or maybe using the time to make connections on your way from A to B. Unlike my quick changes to the map system, these changes would have taken a lot more time, and would not necessarily ensure that the driving would be enjoyable, just a little more engaging. In addition to that, also taking out the damage count at the end of cases, unless you choose it as an option, maybe as a higher difficulty setting where you have no GPS, or even hints that are allowed. Outside of the issues with the city, there are numerous issues with the mechanics that are deeply core to the player's experience with the game. Elements such as chase sequences, dialogue choices carry major flaws on their shoulders. When it comes to chase sequences, whether it's in your car or on foot, there is a compelling perception that every chase has a predetermined fate. Maybe it's the game not wanting the player to fail sequences and not get the content that they made, or an extension of the hand-holding that's seen across the game, like being given information that's necessary for a case rather than discovering it on our own, or they make us see the evidence multiple times to ensure the player will get it. It all lends to this idea that the developers really don't trust the player, and this shines through most in the chase sequences. With nearly every case having a predetermined end, the act of chasing cars turns into a follow mission, waiting until they inevitably crash or slow down at a specific point and we are allowed to take them out. Even when the player somehow gets a perfectly executed hit on the car we're pursuing, the cars can bounce and fly around on top of other cars, almost as if saying, "I can't crash now, just be patient." All of these chases are even made more frustrating as you have a partner halfway out the window yelling at you to catch up to the car when it's programmed to stay a perfect distance away, so you really can't do anything the game has not planned for. Rubber banding the cars closer and further away, giving the player an idea that they're making progress, but we all know we would be much more productive to let the perp drive away and crash into a wall eventually while we find somewhere to relax and order drinks. This problem goes double for the foot chases, as the player is given a set distance away from the criminal and is told, go. Like some race dog told to go until the developers tell us to stop and give us a small cutscene as our good boy for being a good runner. To mix this up, the player is given a small handful of chances to either use a gun to scare the criminals or just to straight up shoot them, but the choice of when these options are available makes zero sense, with some cases of Cole having the ability to shoot someone with no other reason than the fact that they are running, to forcing us to chase down people who just killed or knocked out another police officer. The freedom that is allowed to the player in these chase sequences is nearly non-existent. This restriction seen most often in the chase sequences, the larger game of doing actual police work, suffers also. Being given a chance to do some real police work, I took it into my own hands to investigate a small clue hinted at in an early case titled Industrial Street. Excited at this idea of doing some real investigating, I scoured the map for this street. Eventually, I found it, the bottom of the map, and I went there. Upon arriving at this street, I drove up and down, keeping an eye out for anything that looked suspicious. And this was by far the most involved I had ever been in the game, and I was thrilled at the idea of the freedom that I was allowed and possibly finding this location. Out of the corner of my screen, I noticed something different about a building, and I jumped out of my patrol car and found disappointment. Inside the building that I would come to later this case was nothing. No people, no evidence, no even ability to open the door that could later be opened with tons of evidence behind it, enough to convict every suspect. However, to my great disappointment, my detective days were over and it was back to the linear story that I'd started. These small problems that exist across the game are small indications of a greater problem that LA Noire has. It's the lack of trust in the player. From directed, highly linear cases to newspapers that give plot points away hours early, and constant hand-holding and fear of what if the player does something different, or what if they forget something, creates a short leash for the player that detective work isn't conducive to, and by extension turned into a slow march from location to location, hoping that you are collecting everything and guessing the facial animations correctly to move forward. With the player needing to follow that linear path, the conversations and interrogations can hurt the experience also, because if you miss out on a bit of information that the game doesn't think to give you an alternate way of finding out, then the player can be just out of luck and need to rely purely on guesswork to figure out what comes next, leading to the most difficult and ambiguous element of the interrogation system is the doubt option. Clicking on the doubt button is a slot machine of emotions. You might win big and get a calm, easygoing response from Cole as he tries to gently coax more information out of someone, or you get Tornado Cole, entering a conversation like a monster, yelling and threatening everyone in his path with jail, violence, or just ambiguous threats. Now, across many different discussions that I've had about this game, I have found one resounding statement about the doubt option, and that's not to call it a doubt button, rather a force option. Knowing this, when I played through LA Noire for this retrospective, I found myself getting more of these force dialogue options correct than when I had considered it a doubt option. Despite my distaste for how Cole's reactions can be a little over the top, a simple change of description would create a much more satisfying and understandable interrogation system by changing doubt to force. In spite of all these issues that exist, LA Noire still holds a special place in our hearts, even mine, in the face of all my criticisms that you've listened to throughout this video. There's nothing like it that came before and still nothing like it since. Through all of its shortcomings, it tells a story of a city like no other game does, bringing the player into a city fraught with change and fear and hope, telling the player to make this a better place, and we do. From case to case, we share the morals that Cole carries with him, encouraging us to be better and live up to what he believes. Through the cultural, social, political problems spread across the city, we are seen as a force of good against a ever-growing corruption. I talked earlier about the questions that we were left with from our transitions from the Vice Desk to the Arson Desk. And the most important question of those being, who is this story about? Now, this story is not about individual characters or crime or the pursuit of good. It's a story of a city. We are told from the very beginning of the game that LA is a city on the verge of greatness.
A city on the verge of greatness. A new type of city, based not on the man, but on the automobile.
But through our journey, we only see the hardship, the pain, the anger, and selfishness. We don't see the greatness in the city that we're told about because it's not come yet. The greatness doesn't come with us, but rather follows us. We, as Cole, are one of those small pieces across the city that fight for something greater, and in the end, pushing the city one more step towards the greatness to come. I want to thank you all for making it to the end of this video, and for that I would like to introduce my very first giveaway. For those of you who have been following my channel, I started off my Pixel Report series with the 2017 Prey game analyses, and found it to be the most fitting game to give away. To put your name in for this giveaway, all you need to do is click that subscribe button below, because I will be selecting one subscriber as the winner at the end of October. So if you're interested, all you need to do is click that subscribe button right down there and keep checking back to see what giveaway I will be bringing out next month. This video was a massive undertaking, but I loved every second of it, and I hope you enjoyed it too. I know it was a very long video, longer than most, but if you got a chance to make it this far, thank you very much. It's been about 2 weeks since my last video, but I'm trying to get much more regular content out. This means I want to try and get stuff out about every single week. Now, if you want to follow along with the progression and where these videos are going, be sure to follow me on Twitter. My Twitter handle's right about here. I'll put a link in below, and I'll put it somewhere on my channel so that you can subscribe to True Devin J and just follow me along. Please let me know what you think of this video. If you loved it, hit the subscribe button. If you liked it, hit the like button. If you have something you want to say, if you didn't like it, don't be afraid to drop it in the comments. And if you hated it, I'm sure there's a thumbs down button there for you too. In the end, this has been Devin J, and I can't wait to see you on the next one.